So we're here with our good friend Phil in Leeds. Phil, firstly, it's a pleasure to meet you. How are you? How's your family doing? And it's great to finally link up.
Well, first of all, welcome to Leeds, what I believe to be the epicentre of Rugby League. It's great to have you here. I think your presence in the World Cup is one of the reasons why we love International Rugby League. The fact that you're bringing effectively a new continent to the men's game, Brazil are doing it in the women's game, USA are doing it in the wheelchair. I think that's what we get excited about, so I think the pleasure is ours to have you here rather than the other way around.
Much appreciated, thank you very much. Before we get into a bit of Jamaica and the World Cup ahead, you had a chance to interact with Romeo a couple of years ago for the England Knights game, and I just wanted to get a bit of feedback with you as it relates to the Jamaican camp, the players, and just your thoughts about the quality in the depth of the talent.
I think it's probably the strongest Jamaican squad I think that's ever represented the nation, and I think it needs to be. It's going up a level. Clearly the World Cup does that. I also think that there's far more reasons than just playing, and we saw that a little with the England Knights game a couple of years ago when the crowd felt different at Headingley that night. So it was a good crowd. I think there were over 7,500 people there, but to hear the steel drums and to have maybe a slightly different menu on for people to see families there who you perhaps wouldn't normally see at a rugby league game, getting into the fact that they may not understand the nuances of the offside rule, but they certainly knew which team they were going to support on the day. I think then Jamaica's performance against Scotland at Featherstone to get a memorable draw again took it up another level. And I think that because the World Cup's been postponed for a year, I know that Romeo has said that perhaps might have disadvantaged what you hoped you might do. I think it just makes more players available for you as well. So there's balances of it. But just looking at the group, the fight for second place, if you like, is massive. There isn't a huge amount of difference, I don't think, between the three nations. And the thing about that is if you do manage to make the quarterfinals, that's qualification for 2025. So the thing about all of this is every group game, every minute is going to matter.
Right, so as you know, in terms of Jamaicans in the UK, they played a massive part in rebuilding the country after the Second World War. And they settled in places such as London, Manchester, Yorkshire, the Midlands, amongst any other area in the country. So with Jamaica being situated in Leeds, does this almost feel like the game against Ireland will be like a home game for Jamaica?
I think so. I mean, clearly there is an area, a suburb of Leeds, Caplan, with the Caplan Cougars community club down there, where there's been a lot of Jamaican people live. It's almost like a little enclave, a home from home, but we've never really given them rugby league in a concerted manner. I think there have been some fantastic rugby league players of Jamaican heritage, but until there is an island nation team and you can feed back into that, it's a limit to what we can do to engage that community. I think having you here within the diaspora of Leeds is massive. There are Caribbean restaurants in that part of the city. I think there is a real feel of togetherness. I know that some of the promotional stuff you'll be doing and some of the community clubs you'll be going to see are in that area, and the hope is that irrespective of how the results go on the field, and we hope that obviously you're making that quarter final, that's what you'll leave behind, that people will see role models in a sport that perhaps they're not as familiar with, and they'll go away and think, well, why can't I be in a World Cup in 10, 15 years time? And that's women as well as men, and I think that's really important.
So, as you know, for over 3 centuries, England colonised Jamaica prior to independence, and they introduced some fantastic games, the likes of football, cricket, athletics, union, but it took a while for league to come to Jamaica. Would you say that was down to perhaps the governing body of Rugby League to perhaps have done more work of introducing the game in the former British colonies, perhaps?
I think there's two sides to that coin. One is Rugby League has never been a rich game, so it's not like it has money to invest in development in nations. It's down to volunteers like Romeo, which is why I think his story is so exciting and should be told to as many people as possible. And he's not the only one. I've been privileged to do the media side of the European Federation, which Jamaica comes under. Not in Europe, I don't know why. Needs rebranding. But seeing the work that's gone on slowly over the island with people who have committed, body and soul to try and make that work is a fantastic story, and they deserve enormous credit because there isn't central funding for it. Rugby League has never been that kind of a game. I think the other thing is, until both codes went professional in round about 1995, Rugby League was actually banned in the armed forces and the civil services. So what Rugby Union in particular had an advantage for was that when there was colonisation, it was seen as the establishment sport, so it was almost expected to be played. Rugby League guys were playing Rugby Union in the Second World War because there wasn't Rugby League to be played, so they were representing army teams. So wherever there has been colonisation, it's always brought the game of the establishment. And in terms of rugby, that's always been Rugby Union and never Rugby League. So it's really only been until probably about maybe the World Cup of 1995 when Maurice Lindsay, who was in charge of the RFL at the time, he decided to split the Pacific nations and try and get away from this. There's only really Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain and France, to realise that now the body of players that are coming into the sport, particularly Pacific Islanders in the Southern Hemisphere, could and should be replicated in the North.
Yeah, something I've always wondered for a couple of decades is why Yorkshire as a whole, West Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, is so mad about rugby league. Why is it such a religion up here?
Well, the game was born here, so the meeting at the George Hotel was in Huddersfield that actually formed the Northern Union. So I think that's mainly because geographically it was halfway between Yorkshire and Lancashire, but we're taking credit for the fact that the game has a birthday, and that was celebrated in West Yorkshire. There are no other sports I know of that can trace a founding date. It's always been progression from a few people playing to, at some point let's get codified rules and let's play against each other. Rugby League was born in a hotel room on a particular afternoon in Huddersfield, so I think Yorkshire lays claim to that. The interesting thing I think for Yorkshire is that there aren't many cities that play Rugby League. But clearly Leeds is a major city of a population of over 1 million that does, and Leeds has always had a passion for rugby. And when that split came in 1895, virtually all of the major clubs moved over to what we now call Rugby League. So there were some Rugby Union stalwarts like Morley who didn't, but the bulk of them did. So Rugby League became really prominent in the city. The other thing about Leeds is that it virtually for all of its administrative life, the offices of the Rugby League have been based in Leeds. So it was originally Chapeltown Road, very close to where the Jamaica community are. Then it moved out to Red Hall, which is in the leafy suburbs of the north. So there's always been an administrative link to Leeds, but because it is the largest city that's played it almost continuously from the beginning of the Northern Union split, then I think it's embedded itself here. Around places like Leeds, you've got a lot of villages that were single industry villages, and a lot of that was mining, particularly Featherstone, Castleford, Wakefield, that kind of an area. So all of those industries tended to tap into Rugby League in the early days. Football wasn't as big as it is now. We seem to think that it's all encompassing. Actually, rugby occupied the position that football now does, probably up to the beginning of the 20th century. So there was a huge amount of civic pride, huge amount of derby rivalry, and again, because you've got so many towns and villages so concentrated geographically, then the likes of Bramley in West Leeds wanted to play Hunslet in South Leeds, and it was a big deal. Civic pride was at stake. So I think because it's really a tight-knit geographical area, the local butchers, bakers and candlestick makers who were behind the rugby clubs when they set up really wanted them to reflect the communities and what was in there. So I think that's why there is a replication, a little bit of that in Lancashire. I have to give them that. Wigan is built around coal mining, not just pie eating, but there is a heavier concentration in Yorkshire.
Yes, I was going to ask, west of the Pennines, Manchester, Merseyside, Lancashire, if they just followed what was happening over in Yorkshire and said, this could work for us as well?
It's really interesting because Manchester has never been Manchester. It's been Rochdale, Oldham, Salford, Swinton. So there hasn't ever been there was Bellevue Rangers, which was based in Manchester, but there was never really a club that represented the city. There wasn't a Manchester United, for example, Rugby League equivalent.
Right.
Liverpool has always sort of been almost an outpost. It's never really taken to Rugby League other than it's staged some very big games at Anfield, and there have been teams, Liverpool City were a team, but not that embraced the whole city. The rivalry in both Manchester and Liverpool, you've got two football teams in each, and once they started becoming established, the rivalry between those two alone, you were either Everton or Liverpool, you were either the red side of Manchester or the blue side of Manchester. No other sport really got a look in to the same extent, and whereas you have got Leeds United in Leeds, they didn't become a force until 1965. So again, rugby has had that run right from 1895 and has a really solid core base. Hull is a little bit the same, that it's sort of on the outpost on the east coast, and that had that rivalry of Hull FC and Hull KR, and once you get that in a city, it's very hard for another sport to then come in and break that. So although football is played at Hull City and they've got an important fan base, it's not quite, you've got to be a black and white or you've got to be a red and white even if you support Hull City. So yeah. I think that's the difference over there, that their major areas of population didn't really have a team that represented the whole city.
If I were to ask a passionate sports fan in Leeds that on the weekend Leeds Rhinos and Leeds United would play, what would they tell you they would go to, or they'd try to go to both?
Well, the way it used to be fixtured, when television didn't have such an impact over sport as a whole, and that dictates the scheduling these days, is they used to play on alternate weekends, and the joy for someone like me who was growing up at a time when both teams were renowned was you could go to both. You could go to Leeds United one week and watch them thrash West Ham, and then you could go to Headingley the other week and watch Leeds beat Keighley. And it was a joy, it was an absolute joy, and the teams got on really well together and used to socialise every now and again. That has changed, and football has become, this huge monolith. So if you were to ask the general public of Leeds, do they hear more about football or do they hear more about rugby league, they would say football. And there's a waiting list for season tickets now that Leeds United are back in the Premier League. But what I think we've got is just an awareness with the World Cup that something's happening here. The semi-final is at Ellen Road, and that, if seeding goes to place, would be Australia against New Zealand, and I think you would find that there's a lot of neutral interest in that. The chance to see those two teams who are absolute, massive names that we don't get to see on our shore that often anymore, playing on the same pitch. We would rush to go and watch that. And I think the continued success that the Rhinos have had, a generational team that's now broken up but won 5 grand finals in 6 years and had guys like Rob Burrow and Danny Maguire and Kevin Sinfield playing for them. Those names have transcended rugby league in many ways, so people know about them, and they appreciate the qualities of rugby league and what it stands for. So football would win, but there isn't as much a gap as you would see in a lot of other places.
When you take a deep look at the Jamaican squad and see of the 24, 16 of them born and raised in Yorkshire, another 2, one born in London, one born in Northampton, it shouldn't be a surprise, should it, bearing in mind the emergence and growth of the game?
Yeah, obviously they have come in on the back of where it's strong, and one of the things the sport hopefully will do as a legacy of this tournament is go to places like Coventry and leave a mark, go to Arsenal for a semi-final, and you would hope maybe if England are in that, have 60,000 people there, and it's then what you do with that, and I'm not sure that we've done it well enough as a sport. We had a game in 2013 in the World Cup in Bristol, America against the Cook Islands. You'd think that teams ranked 15th and 16th in that tournament, maybe not many people turn up. Wednesday night it rained a lot, 8,000 people there in Bristol, but we didn't go back and play another game or capitalise. I would hope that, irrespective of how many Yorkshire people are in this Jamaican squad, which clearly means they all like mushy peas and Yorkshire pudding, so your diet will be fine. It's more to do with when's your next international fixture? Can we now get a run of games for Jamaica where you're playing every October, either at home on the island that you can have teams coming in and touring, providing we can find the facilities that you can play at, or do you know that you're playing at least 2 or 3 internationals here, which maybe you can take to Birmingham, where perhaps there's a big Jamaican population. Now we've got a team called Midlands Hurricanes playing out of a stadium in Birmingham. To me, that's the obvious place to take a Jamaican international. But we've got to get that international calendar on the back of this World Cup.
Yeah, certainly it's an exciting time when you're bearing in mind the wheelchair tournaments, the women's and men's tournaments as well. So there is an exciting time ahead. From a Jamaican perspective, what for you would be considered a success? And I'm not talking in terms of results, but just in terms of the performances.
I think getting better each game you play, because clearly the mix of the squad is few full-time Super League, few part-time, few who are coming from the island. I mean, to gel that as a squad, that's a really difficult task. You've then got to go out and play your first game, where I don't think you'll be as cohesive as you will the more you play. So I think to improve performances each time you go on the field, the chance to stay in the race for second in the group and having fun, bringing new people to the sport, bringing a different cultural element to Rugby League, making those who come feel welcome, part of something, which I think is what Rugby League does really well. I'm biased, but I do think that once you're in the family, you can see why it's called a family, and you feel part of a family. And like every family, it's got its dysfunctional elements, and we make no apology for that. But I think once you're entranced by what the guys are doing on the field, because unless you give everything, you'll get found out. And I think the one thing that the fans will be looking for, the Jamaican people, will be, do you represent us as well as we would like you to? And that's, as you say, is not necessarily about a result. It's about never giving in. It's about playing a certain way. It's about looking to enjoy yourselves and promote the ball and run with the ball, because you're athletes, so don't get involved in playing up the middle and seeing who can bash the opposition the most. There's plenty of teams that can do that. You can play rugby and you'll want to promote the ball. And I think people will enjoy the style of rugby you play, and also I think you'll enjoy the experience, because it's not often you get to play 3 great teams in consecutive matches.
Phil, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you in a yellow jersey come Sunday.
I'm looking for the yellow shorts, actually. They would suit my legs.